The Accident. Chapter 1. A Refuge of Someone Else's Memories. Alice Morris had grown accustomed to piecing her life back together, like a jigsaw puzzle scattered by a careless hand. For the past 5 years, she had been constructing the perfect picture: a thriving career at a design studio, a cozy downtown apartment with panoramic windows, an engagement ring on her finger from a man named Mark. She had believed this to be her final form, but it turned out to be merely a draft. It all fell apart in a single evening, with the same ease as a glass of expensive wine shattering on a stone floor. "I can't breathe the same air as you, Alice," Mark had said, and his eyes held no hatred, only a weary indifference. "You vanish into your work, you've become a ghost in our own life." The phrase, "a ghost in your own life," burned hotter than any insult. She collected her things from their shared apartment, filed for a leave of absence due to a nervous breakdown, and locked herself in her studio, staring at blank sheets of drawing paper, unable to draw a single line. The creative block was like a thick, white haze, swallowing every one of her ideas. It was then that the letter from the lawyer arrived. Her Aunt Agatha, her long-deceased mother's sister, had passed away quietly in her old house on the outskirts of the city, bequeathing it to Alice. They had met only twice: at her mother's funeral, when Alice was 10, and once when her aunt had visited the city briefly. Alice remembered her lean, upright frame, her piercing gray eyes, filled with a quiet, ancient sorrow, and the scent of lavender and old wood that seemed to be her personal fragrance. The real estate agent pursed his lips as he showed her the house. "A unique property with potential, Miss Morris. It just needs a little imagination." Alice understood the code: old, creaky, and unwanted. But when she first crossed its threshold, an unexpected feeling washed over her. It wasn't happiness or delight. It was a profound, almost physical relief. The city noise remained outside, held at bay by the thick walls of wild stone. Sunlight, filtering through the dusty stained glass windows, painted rainbow patterns on the worn oak parquet. The air was filled with a familiar, soothing smell of lavender, beeswax, and thyme. "A ghost in my own life?" Alice thought, running her hand over the rough surface of the stone wall. Well, now this ghost has a haunt of her own. She decided to stay. This house, full of someone else's memories, had become her only refuge from her own shattered present. Chapter 2. The First Anomaly. Had the house been a person, those first weeks would have been a time of timid, mutual study. Alice grew accustomed to its rhythms, and it, in turn, seemed to patiently accept her presence. Her days were filled with pleasant chores that finally tired her body, but not her soul. She unpacked her books, arranging them on the shelves of an old oak cabinet, delighting in the soft thud they made against the wood. She dusted the massive carved dresser, discovering the beautiful grain of the mahogany beneath. She washed the stained glass windows, and the sunlight, now brighter, flooded the floor with vivid pools of color: blue, crimson, emerald. At night, the house did not frighten her. It lulled her to sleep. The city's din was replaced by a soothing symphony of nature: the whisper of pine branches outside the window, the chirping of crickets, and the quiet, measured creaking of its old bones, the floorboards and beams cooling after the day's warmth. For the first time in many months, Alice slept deeply and without dreams, her face growing more relaxed in the mornings, the shadows beneath her eyes beginning to fade. The first anomaly occurred almost a month after she moved in, on a Saturday night. Summer had reached its peak, and even the nights were warm and stifling. As always, Alice had left the window in her second-floor bedroom wide open, inviting in the scent of blooming jasmine. She was having a strange, plotless dream, wandering through an endless corridor with many closed doors. Suddenly, the dream shattered, and her consciousness plunged violently into reality with a sensation of suffocation. She was lying there, unable to draw a full breath, The air in the room was thick, heavy, and utterly still, as if she had been entombed alive in a crypt. It wasn't just stale, it was ancient, smelling not of flowers and dust, but of must, damp earth, and something else, a sweetish rotten scent she couldn't identify. Her heart hammered in panic. Alice sat up sharply in bed, peering into the moonlight filtering through the stained glass. The curtains stirred slightly. So, there was movement of air. She got up, walked barefoot to the window, and leaned out. The cool night breeze caressed her face. She took several deep, greedy gulps of the fresh air. It was nothing, she tried to convince herself, just a nightmare. But the moment she stepped away from the window and into the room, the same invisible, stifling veil enveloped her once more. It was like crossing an unseen barrier. By the window it was fresh and cool. 2 steps from the bed it was unbearably close and heavy. The air was dead, stagnant, refusing to mingle with the living world outside. Driven by an irrational fear, Alice walked around the entire room, her arm outstretched before her like a blind person. She could literally feel the boundaries of this anomaly. It was localized in the center of the bedroom, especially dense right by the bed, and dissipated towards the walls. It was inexplicable, defying every law of physics. Shivering, she grabbed her pillow and blanket and went downstairs to the living room, where she spent the remainder of the night, wrapped in a throw and without closing her eyes. In the morning, with the first rays of the sun, she cautiously returned to the bedroom. The room was bathed in light, filled with fresh morning air, and smelled simply of an old house. No stuffiness, no scent of decay. Alice let out a sigh of relief and tried once more to convince herself that it had all been a continuation of the same nightmare, a trick of an overactive imagination. But deep down, in her very core, a tiny, cold certainty had taken root. There was something fundamentally wrong with the house, and its silent hospitality had come to an end. Chapter 3. Footsteps in the Hall. Several days had passed since the incident with the stifling bedroom. Alice tried to behave as usual. She drank her morning coffee in the kitchen, read in the living room, walked in the garden overgrown with wild briar roses. But something inside her had shifted. Her former sense of refuge had been replaced by wary anticipation. She caught herself listening to the silence, searching not for its comforting notes, but for disquieting ones. The first sounds came on Thursday, deep in the night. It wasn't the creak of aging wood to which she had grown accustomed. That sound was random, disjointed. This one was rhythmic and deliberate. Quiet, measured footsteps. They came from the hallway outside her bedroom, right behind the massive oak door. Someone was pacing slowly back and forth, from the staircase to, as it seemed to her, the far wall with the locked room she hadn't yet furnished. Alice froze, holding her breath, her entire being focused into listening. The steps were too distinct to be a trick of the imagination. They weren't light or ghostly. No. This was the heavy, weary tread of a grown adult. A man. He wasn't dragging his feet or shuffling. He was deliberately measuring his steps exactly 7 in one direction, a pause, a turn, and 7 back. It was a ritual, a monotonous, rehearsed movement, filled with such bottomless, hopeless sorrow that Alice's heart unexpectedly clenched not from fear, but from a sharp, alien grief. This grief was so thick and dense it seemed to seep through the crack under the door, filling the room with an invisible fog of despair. Her first reaction was rational. The house is old, she told herself. A draft is banging a shutter, or the pipes are making that noise. But her own mind immediately objected. A draft doesn't walk 7 distinct steps back and forth. Pipes don't pause to turn around. Mustering all her will, she sat up abruptly and clicked the switch on her bedside lamp. Light flooded the room, casting bizarre shadows from the furniture onto the walls. The footsteps ceased instantly. An absolute, deafening silence fell. It was even more terrifying than the sounds themselves. It was the silence of a lurking creature, frozen in wait. "Is someone there?" Alice called out, her voice sounding unnaturally loud and hoarse. The only answer was the same silence. Deep, bottomless. She lay like that for several minutes, listening until the pulse in her own ears began to ring. Nothing. With relief, she turned off the light and slowly sank back onto the pillow. And exactly 3 minutes later, just as her breathing evened out and she began to drift into oblivion, the footsteps started again. The same rhythm, the same unbearable sorrow. This time, they carried not just sadness, but something akin to impatience, an expectation. As if someone had been waiting for this moment of her seeming calm to resume his endless, lonely vigil, to show her, "I am still here, and I have no peace." Alice did not sleep until dawn, curled into a ball under the covers and staring at the ceiling. She didn't dare turn the light on again. She was afraid not so much of the footsteps themselves, but of that eloquent, ominous silence that answered her. It was worse than any sound. It meant that on the other side of the door, someone was there. And that someone was aware of her presence and reacting to it. When the sky outside began to lighten and the footsteps finally faded, Alice understood. This was not a trick of her imagination. It was a dialogue. A very one-sided and frightening one, but a dialogue nonetheless. And she had to find a way to answer it. Chapter 4. The Whisper at the Bedside. A week had passed since the footsteps became an integral part of the night. Alice had almost come to accept this ghastly ritual. She had learned to fall asleep to their monotonous tapping, just as a city dweller sleeps through the noise of a highway. It was the sound of her new normal, the sound of a sorrow that had become mere background noise. She had even begun, or so she thought, to detect different shades in them. Sometimes it was just weariness, other times an anxious anticipation, and once something akin to a flash of anger, when the steps grew sharper and faster. But all of that was merely a prelude. That night was especially dark and still. The moon had vanished behind thick clouds, and the bedroom was filled with an almost tangible gloom. Alice slept lightly, the way a soldier sleeps on the front line, and she was awakened not by a sound, but by a sensation, a sharp, chilling, animal feeling of another's presence. She heard no footsteps, no creaks. She simply knew someone was in the room. She lay on her side, facing the wall, and didn't dare to move. The air behind her grew dense and cold, as if someone had opened a freezer door. Goosebumps erupted down her spine. Slowly, with immense effort, she turned over to her other side, facing the room. Nothing. Only the familiar shapes of the dresser and the armchair, barely discernible in the dark. But the feeling of presence didn't fade. It intensified. It was concentrated right here, just centimeters from her bedside. She stared into the blackness until colored spots began to dance before her eyes. And suddenly, it began. At first, it was just a rustle, quiet, like the stirring of dry leaves. Then it took form. A voice. A soft, wet, halting whisper, emanating from the void. It wasn't in her ears, but directly in her mind, and that made it 100 times more terrifying. "Can't find." The voice was broken, barely intelligible, as if its owner had forgotten how to speak. There was no malice in it, only an all-consuming, bottomless anguish. Alice froze, paralyzed by an ancient, instinctual fear. Her fingers clawed at the edge of the sheet, with such force they were on the verge of tearing the fabric. She couldn't scream, couldn't move. She could only listen. The pause felt like an eternity. The air by the bedside shifted, growing colder still. "My threshold," the voice whispered, and in those two words lay such an aching, unbearable sorrow that her own fear momentarily retreated, yielding to a sharp, piercing pity. This was no abstract mystery of the house. This was pain, living, pulsating, and with no way out. She saw no one, but she felt it there in the room with her was an inexpressible tragedy, stuck between worlds like a splinter in the flesh of reality. The whisper did not return. The feeling of icy cold at her bedside slowly dissipated, giving way to the ordinary cool of the night. The oppressive presence was gone. But the echo of that whisper, full of despair, hung in the air for a long time. Alice did not close her eyes until morning. She sat hugging her knees, staring at the spot where the void had just spoken of its pain. The fear had not gone away, but now it had a specific name, threshold, and she understood she could not simply let this be. She could not ignore a cry for help, even if it came from the void. At dawn, her hands trembling from lack of sleep and the horror she'd endured, she poured herself a cup of strong tea instead of coffee and made a decision. She would not run. She had to find the answer. She had to find this threshold. Chapter 5. The Truth in Yellowed Pages. Morning found Alice at the kitchen table, a cold cup of tea in her hands. The night's terror had been replaced by a cold, crystalline resolve. The pity she had felt in that terrible moment had proven stronger than the fear that someone, that voice hadn't wanted to frighten her. It was begging for help, and she was obligated to try. For the first time in many months, her life had found not just a refuge, but a purpose. She worked methodically, like a detective gathering evidence. First, a thorough inspection of the house. She went back down to the basement, to that very workshop. Now, armed with the keyword threshold, she examined it with redoubled attention, and she found it. The door to a tiny, neglected storage closet she had previously ignored. The oak threshold before it was covered in scratches. They were old, polished, smooth by time, but deep and chaotic, as if left in a panic by some creature cornered. Or a man, desperately clinging to life. Alice ran her fingers over these scars in the wood, and a shiver ran through her. The next step was the city archive, housed in the basement of the old library. The elderly archivist, Mr. Dobbs, a man whose face was a map of wrinkles charting his long years, took one look at her pale, determined face, merely nodded, and without a word led her to a room with wooden shelves that smelled of dust and slowly decaying paper. "What are we searching for, my dear?" he asked in a voice like the rustling of pages. "The house on Acacia Street. Something from its past. An accident, perhaps," said Alice, not daring to name the true reason. Mr. Dobbs muttered something under his breath and disappeared into the labyrinth of shelves, returning with a thick bound volume of the local newspaper, the Evening Chronicle, from the 1920. Handling these fragile, yellowed pages was both thrilling and eerie. It was a journey through time. She scanned headlines about local fairs, shop openings, society gossip, and then, in the issue from October 1923, her eyes fell on a small article on the third page. The headline made her heart stop. "Tragedy at the Harrison House." She began to read, and the words, printed over a century ago, came to life, forming a ghastly picture. On Sunday night, the body of young shoemaker Theodore Harrison, 28, was discovered in his home on Acacia Street. Preliminary findings suggest the accident occurred 2 days prior. Mr. Harrison slipped on the staircase leading to his basement workshop, striking his temple on the oak threshold. The body was discovered by his fiancée, Miss Agatha Morris, who had come to visit after 2 days of failed contact. The police found no evidence of foul play. Miss Morris, according to neighbors, was deeply distressed by the event and was not seen in public for a long time. There it was. The truth, cold and undeniable. Theodore Harrison, his fiancée Agatha Morris, her aunt, the very woman with the sad eyes, whose pain Alice now felt in every fiber of her being. He hadn't been murdered. He wasn't the victim of a villain. He had fallen to a banal, absurd accident that had ended his life on the threshold of his own home. On that very threshold, Alice leaned back in her chair, feeling tears roll down her cheeks. She wasn't crying from fear, but from the overwhelming understanding of the tragedy's depth. He couldn't find his threshold, because that very threshold had become the site of his death, a boundary he could not cross into the afterlife. His soul was stuck in limbo, in an eternal hopeless search for an exit, while his fiancée had remained faithful to his memory until the end of her days, becoming the voluntary guardian of his restless spirit. The puzzle was complete. This was not a malevolent spirit thirsting for revenge. It was inexpressible pain, a tear left unshed for a century. And Alice knew what she had to do. She had to give him what he had been denied. She had to help him cross. Chapter 6. The Final Threshold. Returning to the house with a heavy folder stuffed with copies of old documents felt like stepping back onto an invisible battlefield. Now she had a name, Theodore Harrison. He was 28. He was a shoemaker. He loved his fiancée, Agatha, and died in a ridiculous, terrifying accident, slipping on the stairs in his own home. He was not a ghost, not a monster from a horror story. He was a man whose life had been severed in an instant, leaving behind a festering wound in the very fabric of this place. Alice did not hesitate. Her sense of purpose drove her forward, drowning out the last remnants of fear. She went down to the basement, to the very workshop where, according to the article, Theodore had spent his days. The air here was, as always, unnaturally icy, as if time itself had frozen in October 1923. She turned on the light. A dim bulb cast a yellowish glow on the stone walls, lined with old jars of long-dried paint, scraps of leather, and forgotten tools. Her gaze fell upon that same unremarkable closet door. She approached it and knelt once more, as she had the day before. But this time, her gestures were not those of a timid investigator, but of a deliberate ritual. She placed her palm on the rough, scarred wood of the threshold. Its cold bit deep into her bones, a painful, living cold. She closed her eyes, trying to picture him, not the ghost, but the man, young, full of life, with the scent of leather and glue on his hands. And his final moments: the fall, the impact, the encroaching darkness, the desperate attempts to rise, the helpless scratches of fingernails on this very wood, in a futile hope for salvation. "Theodore," she said softly, and her voice sounded strangely loud in the tomb-like silence of the basement. She felt a tear trace a path down her cheek. It was not self-pity, but a deep, all-encompassing grief for a stranger's unjustly severed life. "I know," she continued, and the words flowed on their own, as if guided by an unseen hand. "I know what happened. I know your name. I know you didn't want to leave. Agatha was waiting for you. She waited for you then, and she waited for you all these years." She spoke to him not as to a ghost, but as to a lost, despairing person. She spoke of his fiancée, of a love that proved stronger than death, compelling one of them to keep faith and the other to remain trapped. "You are awaited," she said with newfound strength, pouring all her belief into the words. "She is already there. You can go. You must release this threshold. It holds you no longer." The moment the last word left her lips, an absolute, ringing silence fell over the house. It wasn't merely the absence of sound. It was the silence of a heart that has stopped, the silence just before the very first breath. The air in the basement grew still, then shuddered. Alice felt it not with her ears, but with her entire being, a soft, barely perceptible sigh of relief that passed through all the walls of the house, from the basement to the attic. It was like the sound a taut string makes when it is finally loosened. And then the icy cold that had lived for a century in the basement quivered and retreated. It was replaced by the coolness of old, but ordinary, stone. The heavy, oppressive stuffiness that had hung in her bedroom for weeks dissolved in an instant, as if it had never been. And at once, as if the house could finally draw a full breath, a light, fresh breeze from the night garden rushed through the basement's open transom window, caressing her tear-streaked cheeks, carrying with it the scent of damp earth and freedom. Alice remained on her knees, her hands still resting on the threshold. But now the wood beneath her palm was just wood, cold, rough, but silent. It no longer held a scream within it. It had finally become just a threshold. Chapter 7. The Quiet House. For the first few days after the night in the basement, Alice lived in a state of tense anticipation. Each evening, lying in bed, she would instinctively listen, searching the silence for familiar sounds. But the house remained silent. It wasn't that it had gone mute, no, it had simply found a different voice. The creak of the floorboards was now just the sound of aging wood, not the footsteps of an unseen wanderer. The wind outside sang its usual song, unmarred by alien sighs. She went down to the basement again. The air was no longer icy and stifling. It was cool and damp, as the air in an old stone basement ought to be. She approached the closet door and laid her hand on the threshold. The wood was cold, but it was the ordinary cold of a material, not a supernatural chill seeping from another world. The scratches were still there, but now they seemed like mere scars from the past, not fresh, bleeding wounds. The feeling was akin to the one that follows a long, debilitating illness, when the fever finally breaks and the body, weakened but cleansed, sinks into a long, healing sleep. The house, at last, was at rest. And this tranquility was transferred to Alice. The weight she had carried since her breakup with Mark, that thick haze of creative block, began to dissipate. One morning at breakfast, her gaze fell upon a vase of apples on the table. Sunlight streamed over them, casting intricate shadows on the wooden surface, playing on their smooth skins. It was a simple, mundane picture, but in that moment, Alice saw a composition in it, a line, a form. She took out her sketchbook and a pencil she hadn't touched in months. The first lines were timid, uncertain. But then her hand began to fly across the paper on its own, capturing the play of light and shadow, the roundness of the fruit, the texture of the wood. She wasn't thinking about Mark, or her failure, or her collapse. She was thinking about the apples, the light, the table. She was here and now, and it was enough. From that day on, she drew every day. The view from the window of the overgrown garden, her Aunt Agatha's old teapot, her own reflection in the mirror with the carved frame. The house became not just a refuge, but her studio, her space. It demanded nothing of her anymore except her presence. It, like she herself, was finally free. Sometimes, on particularly quiet, twilight evenings, when long shadows merged into a single velvety darkness, she thought she heard sounds, but they weren't footsteps or whispers. It was a distant, barely perceptible happy laughter, as if coming from another room. Two voices, one male and one female, merging into one in serene joy. They never lasted long, just a few seconds before dissolving into the approaching night, leaving behind only a feeling of gentle, luminous sorrow and complete, absolute peace. Alice would set her pencil aside, listen to the silence, and smile. She knew it wasn't a hallucination. It was a farewell, or, rather, a confirmation. She hadn't just opened the closet door. She had opened for them that final threshold, the one that separates pain from peace, loneliness from reunion, the past from eternity. And in doing so, she had opened a new path for herself, a path leading from the quiet house, full of light and peace, into her own renewed future.